8 ways 90s talk shows were like YouTube. Hey, it's Prince of Queens, and the other night on a live stream, we watched, I think, an entire episode of the 90s talk show Jenny Jones, and I really have no idea what people who never saw such things in their prime would think of them if they watched them now. Because, of course, I grew up with them. Then, Miss Misa joined the stream while we were watching the show, which was interesting because she likely wasn't even born when it aired, and she's British. So I imagine she, or anybody who isn't at least in their 30s, has no idea what they were missing with American talk shows in the 90s. Because there were so many of them, and it was almost the prototype version of reality television. And then I realized that it was also kind of like a prehistory YouTube in the following 8 ways. The first way 90s talk shows were like YouTube is obviously the audience participation in the comments. They'd really only spend a few minutes talking to each guest in half of the shows like Jerry Springer, Ricky Lake, and Maury Povich. And then they'd have members of the audience basically be a bunch of shitbags and roast the guests. Kind of like in the YouTube comment section. Very few legitimate questions tended to be asked. Usually it's just people saying kind of mean things. The second way that 90s talk shows were like YouTube is that the people got paid to be on them. Now, granted, I don't know how much these people got paid, and I'm guessing they did not survive for any extended period of time with their payment from the shows alone. But judging by how crazy the guests got in the 90s, I have to wonder how much they were actually getting. But it's hard to say because the third way the shows were like YouTube is that a lot of the people on the shows turned out to be trained actors. This has happened on YouTube a number of times, I'm pretty sure. At least I certainly suspect a lot of YouTubers of being actors. Some people seem to think that basically all of the guests on the shows were actors, but I don't think that that was the case. Jerry Springer claimed that the first time he was aware that his guests were actually just actors who were faking it, he didn't know until after the show when he realized that they were a local improv troupe or something. But he and his producers decided not to be angry with them or try to discourage people from doing that in the future because it made for good television. The fourth way that 90s talk shows were like YouTube is that there was basically a version of response videos, which was that guests would sometimes come on to confront past guests who would make an extra appearance. This happened a lot on the Jerry Springer Show, where guests would come to physically fight former guests that they apparently really wanted a piece of for whatever reason. It made for interesting television, and you grew to occasionally become attached to certain characters as they had a long-standing story arc with their repeated appearances. And often the people who were confronting them in the veritable talk show response videos would say things that you always kind of wanted to say to them. Maybe it was more like live streams because the people were interacting, but whatever. The fifth way 90s talk shows and YouTube are similar is that there was always a lot of transgender and LGBT stuff, including teenagers and people who would come on the show and get relatively famous just for being kinda freaky. This wasn't confined to simply LGBT people. There were all sorts of goths and club kids and stuff who might not have even been queer, but most of them seemed to be queer, and those were my favorite. The sixth way that YouTube is kind of like these shows is that they had their own little battle over freedom of speech, which was when they tried to stop Jerry Springer's show for whatever reason. Jerry Springer kinda was the best one, just for the record. When they tried to shut his show down, it was kind of a big deal, and I imagine it would be well worth researching if you are bored and non-busy, which I am not at the moment, so I'm going to move on. The seventh way that YouTube and old talk shows are similar is that there were so many fights. Now, I know you're thinking to yourself, duh. But the thing to keep in mind is that back in the day, you could never really see that much footage of real life fights because we didn't have camera phones and video cameras were really physically large. So it was rare to tape somebody actually getting into a real life fist fight on the street. Fortunately for us, we had talk shows, and it was also pretty surreal to be a little kid or a teenager growing up in the 90s and seeing some 6'3" trans woman fight some big dude dressed up like a pimp and watch her seriously punch him in the face while one of his hoes ends up ripping her weave off from behind. The eighth and final way that talk shows in the 90s were like YouTube is nice to follow that depiction of relatively intense violence, which is that your parents didn't always know not to let you watch it. You see, if your parents still monitored what you watched on television in the 90s, mine really didn't, they still often went to bed early. And of course, the best talk shows came on late. Jenny Jones and Jerry Springer were back to back every weekday night on one channel, and I think Jenny Jones started at 10. So when you tell your parents you were watching TV, they'd ask what you were watching, and you'd say, a talk show. And Jenny Jones was great for the beginning because she just seemed like a super nice lady. So your parents would go to sleep. But then the guests would come out and it would be some 13-year-old girl bragging about turning tricks at the mall or whatever. But your mom wouldn't even be listening. And then Jerry Springer would come on later with all the fighting. So, of course, YouTube is pretty crazy, as we all know. And I imagine many parents block the site entirely. But obviously some don't. So hopefully kids are only watching nice channels like my own and not gangsters curb stomping each other. But I guess I have no control of that. Drop me a comment. Help me out on Patreon if you like my stuff, and stay tuned.